By spring 1945, the United States Navy possessed over 10,000 landing craft and ships, the largest amphibious fleet ever assembled. These vessels ranged from small landing craft vehicle personnel that could beach 36 soldiers to massive landing ship tanks capable of carrying 20 tanks and 200 men directly onto hostile shores. They filled harbors across the Pacific, lined anchorages in the Philippines, and crowded repair facilities from Pearl Harbor to Leyte Gulf. Intelligence officers tallied the numbers with growing concern, for whilst the Japanese surrender would end the war, it would create an unprecedented logistical crisis. What does one do with the largest invasion fleet in history when invasions are no longer needed? The immediate challenge exceeded anything naval planners had anticipated. The landing ships represented an investment exceeding $3 billion, required hundreds of thousands of crew members, and consumed fuel and maintenance resources equivalent to supporting several conventional fleets. Yet their military utility evaporated overnight. The massive amphibious operations planned for the Japanese home islands would never occur. Operation Olympic and Operation Coronet, which would have required every available landing ship, were cancelled. Instead, these vessels faced a new mission, transporting occupation forces to Japan, repatriating prisoners of war, and moving vast quantities of supplies to reconstruction zones. This work would occupy months, but then a reckoning would come. The Navy had to decide which vessels to preserve for future conflicts, which to transfer to allies, and which to eliminate from service. The scale of this decision would reshape not just American naval capacity, but the military capabilities of dozens of nations for decades to come. The United States had built landing ships in quantities that defied traditional naval logic. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards produced 1,511 landing ship tanks, the workhorses of amphibious warfare. These 328-foot vessels could carry 18 tanks or 27 trucks, beach themselves on hostile shores, then retract and return for another load. Beyond these, production included 558 landing ship mediums, 558 landing craft infantry, and over 8,000 smaller landing craft mechanized and landing craft vehicle personnel. At war's end, approximately 2,300 ocean-going landing ships remained operational alongside thousands of smaller craft. They occupied anchorages at Subic Bay, Okinawa, Saipan, and across the Pacific Theater. Many showed wear from years of constant operations. Saltwater had corroded hulls, engines required overhaul, and crews longed for demobilization. Yet the ships themselves retained decades of potential service life. The vessels congregated in several key locations by August 1945. The largest concentration sat in the Philippines, where over 600 landing ships supported MacArthur's planned invasion of Japan. Okinawa harbored another 400, while Saipan and Guam hosted significant numbers. Smaller groups occupied harbors across the Pacific, from Ulithi to the Solomon Islands. In Europe, approximately 300 landing ships remained operational, primarily in Mediterranean ports. The challenge was not merely managing these vessels, but deciding their fate before winter weather in the Pacific made large-scale movements hazardous. The Navy established the 16th Fleet specifically to handle demobilization, a force whose sole mission was reducing America's wartime Navy to peacetime proportions. American priorities diverged sharply from their wartime production philosophy. During the conflict, landing ships were built quickly and cheaply, designed for perhaps 5 years of service. Quality varied dramatically. Some LSTs from established yards like Dravo Corporation or Chicago Bridge and Iron Company were superbly constructed. Others, built by yards with no maritime experience, suffered from poor welding, substandard materials, and questionable engineering. Navy inspectors now examined each vessel, classifying them by condition and remaining service life. The best examples might serve another 20 years. The worst barely merited the voyage home. This assessment would determine which vessels survived and which faced immediate disposal. The Navy developed Operation Magic Carpet to transport servicemen home, and landing ships proved ideal for this work. Between September 1945 and March 1946, Over 200 LSTs and dozens of other landing craft moved hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Pacific. The ships departed Japanese ports crammed with troops, far exceeding their designed capacity. An LST rated for 163 troops might carry 400 soldiers desperate to reach home. These voyages destroyed the vessel's material condition. Overloading strained hulls, constant operation prevented maintenance, and crews focused solely on speed rather than preservation. Many ships that survived the war intact arrived in American waters as mechanical casualties fit only for scrapping. Simultaneously, the Navy initiated the largest vessel transfer program in history. The Lend-Lease agreements and post-war military assistance programs distributed landing ships to nearly 50 nations. Britain received the first allocations in late 1945. The Royal Navy acquired 52 LSTs, designated them as Landing Ships Tank Mark III, and integrated them into the Mediterranean Fleet. These vessels proved invaluable during the Palestine emergency and subsequent Middle Eastern operations. France obtained 39 LSTs in 1946, immediately deploying them to Indochina, where they supported operations against Viet Minh forces. The French designated them as Classe Ouragan and maintained them for over 15 years. The scale of transfers accelerated through 1946 and 1947. Nationalist China received 43 LSTs before the communist victory, though most eventually fell into communist hands. The Philippines acquired 8 LSTs, forming the core of their nascent navy. Greece received 7 vessels, Italy 8, and Thailand 6. Even landlocked nations received landing craft for riverine operations. Each transfer required American crews to deliver the vessels, often across thousands of miles of ocean. Former LST 325 crossed the Atlantic under its own power to serve in the Royal Navy, then the Hellenic Navy, demonstrating the remarkable endurance built into these supposedly temporary vessels. The Soviet Union presented a unique case in landing ship distribution. Under Lend-Lease, the United States had provided limited amphibious capabilities during the war, primarily smaller craft. Post-war, Stalin's government requested access to American landing ship technology. The State Department refused direct transfers, fearing Soviet amphibious capabilities in Europe. Nevertheless, captured Japanese landing craft and intelligence gathered from Eastern European allies provided the Soviet Navy with sufficient information to develop their own designs. The SMB-1 class landing ships appearing in 1950 borrowed heavily from American LST design principles, demonstrating how technology proliferated even without direct transfers. American testing programs absorbed relatively few landing ships compared to other captured technologies. The Navy retained several dozen vessels for experimental purposes at facilities across the United States. The Naval Amphibious Base at Little Creek, Virginia, became the primary development center for amphibious warfare doctrine. Here, engineers tested improvements to bow ramp mechanisms, experimented with different beaching techniques, and developed new equipment for ship-to-shore operations. The David Taylor Model Basin in Maryland received several LSTs for hydrodynamic testing, examining how these flat-bottomed vessels behaved in various sea states. These tests produced valuable data for future amphibious ship designs, though they consumed relatively few vessels compared to the enormous fleet requiring disposal. The landing shipdock vessels, larger and more capable than standard LSTs, received more careful consideration. The Navy had constructed 37 LSD vessels during the war, each capable of carrying 3 LCMs, or 18 LVTs, in a flooded well deck. These ships represented more sophisticated engineering than standard landing craft, with better seakeeping and longer range. The Navy retained 27 LSDs in active service after 1946, recognizing their unique capabilities. The others entered reserve or found roles in experimental programs. USS Ashland tested helicopter operations from amphibious ships in 1948, pioneering techniques that would become standard in later decades. Systematic disposal began in earnest during 1946, as the Navy confronted the reality of maintaining thousands of surplus vessels. The service wanted to retain perhaps 200 landing ships in active service, with another 300 in ready reserve. This left nearly 2,000 ocean-going landing ships requiring disposal alongside thousands of smaller craft. The Navy established disposal facilities at dozens of locations across the Pacific and United States. The largest operation centered on Subic Bay, where over 400 LSTs awaited final decisions. Naval officers organized vessels by condition, separating those suitable for transfer, reserve storage, or immediate scrapping. The scrapping process occurred on an industrial scale unprecedented in naval history. At Terminal Island in California, dozens of landing craft arrived monthly for demolition. Cutting torches reduced LSTs to scrap metal within weeks. The steel entered civilian markets, supporting post-war construction across the American West. Similar operations proceeded at Mobile, Alabama, where Gulf Coast yards dismantled hundreds of vessels. The work continued through 1947 and 1948, eliminating the majority of wartime construction. Economic factors drove this destruction. Maintaining vessels in reserve required resources the Navy needed elsewhere. The steel itself held value in reconstruction efforts, and maintaining excessive numbers of obsolete designs made little strategic sense when improved amphibious ships were already in development. The disposal extended beyond scrapping. The Navy designated dozens of landing ships as targets for weapons testing. At Bikini Atoll, several LSTs participated in Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb tests of July 1946. LST-220 survived the first blast, but sank during the second test. These vessels provided valuable data about nuclear weapons effects on amphibious shipping, though at the cost of their destruction. Conventional weapons testing at Chesapeake Bay and off Southern California consumed additional dozens of landing craft. Torpedoes, aerial bombs, and naval gunfire systematically destroyed vessels that had survived the war intact. This testing served legitimate military purposes, examining vulnerabilities and proving new weapons, but it eliminated significant numbers of historic vessels. Some landing ships met ignominious ends through simple abandonment. Across the Pacific, particularly in remote anchorages, the Navy simply walked away from vessels deemed not worth recovering. The cost of sailing deteriorated LSTs thousands of miles exceeded their scrap value. These ships were stripped of useful equipment, then left to rust in tropical harbors. The islands around Palau, the Philippines, and Solomon Islands accumulated dozens of such hulks. Over decades, weather and corrosion consumed them. Some were buried by tropical growth. Others broke apart in storms, scattering wreckage across beaches. Local populations occasionally salvaged metal, but most simply dissolved into tropical decay, their steel returning to oxide. By 1950, the Navy had reduced its landing ship inventory to manageable proportions. Approximately 150 LSTs remained in active service, divided between Atlantic and Pacific fleets. Another 200 sat in reserve at various facilities, maintained in a state allowing rapid reactivation. This reserve proved providential when war erupted in Korea in June 1950. The sudden demand for amphibious capabilities saw dozens of mothballed LSTs return to service within months. Veterans of Pacific campaigns found themselves once again beaching on hostile shores, this time at Inchon and Wonsan. The Korean War temporarily arrested disposal programs as vessels scheduled for scrapping received reprieve for active service. The Korean conflict demonstrated that amphibious capability remained relevant in modern warfare. Consequently, landing ships that survived until 1950 often remained in service for decades beyond initial expectations. LST-1156, commissioned in 1944, served continuously until 1972, participating in operations from Korea to Vietnam. Dozens of sisters followed similar trajectories. The Navy's modernization programs upgraded these vessels with improved electronics, better armament, and enhanced capabilities. What began as cheap temporary wartime construction evolved into long-serving workhorses of the Cold War Navy. Foreign service extended the operational lives of transferred landing ships even further. HMS Stryker, originally USS LST-763, served in the Royal Navy until 1962. The Hellenic Navy operated American-built LSTs until the 1990s. nearly half a century after their construction. These vessels saw combat in numerous Cold War conflicts. French LSTs fought in Indochina and Algeria. Chinese nationalist LSTs evacuated forces from the mainland in 1949. Philippine LSTs supported counterinsurgency operations for decades. The simple, robust design that made them easy to build in wartime proved equally valuable in peacetime service. Nations with limited defense budgets found American landing ships provided capabilities they could not otherwise afford. Preservation efforts came late and saved relatively few examples. Unlike aircraft or tanks, landing ships attracted minimal interest from museums or collectors. Their enormous size, maintenance requirements, and unglamorous appearance worked against preservation. Nevertheless, several examples survived into the modern era. USS LST 325, now restored and operational in Evansville, Indiana, represents the sole ocean-going LST remaining in the United States. Volunteers restored the vessel after acquiring it from Greece in 2000. It regularly participates in historical events, demonstrating capabilities that once moved armies across oceans. Several other LSTs survive as museums or memorials. USS LST 393 rests in Muskegon, Michigan, converted to a museum ship in 2005. In Britain, HMS Stalker, formerly USS LST 1074, served as a static training ship before preservation efforts began in recent years. These survivors represent fewer than 5 examples from over 1,000 vessels built. The contrast with other weapon systems is stark. Dozens of B-17 bombers survive, hundreds of Sherman tanks rest in museums, but landing ships virtually vanished from the historical record. Their preservation happened almost accidentally through the determination of small groups rather than coordinated national efforts. The influence of wartime landing ship design on post-war naval development proved substantial despite the vessel's wholesale destruction. The LST concept, delivering heavy equipment directly to beaches, became fundamental to American amphibious doctrine. Later classes like the Newport-class LSTs, commissioned in the 1960s, improved on wartime designs with higher speeds and better seakeeping, but retained the same fundamental mission. The well-deck concept pioneered in LSTs evolved into modern amphibious assault ships carrying helicopters and landing craft. Every marine amphibious operation from Inchon to Kuwait to Afghanistan relied on descendants of World War II landing craft technology. The speed with which history eliminated these vessels reflected broader patterns in post-war demobilization. America emerged from World War II with military forces vastly exceeding peacetime needs. The landing ship fleet represented just one element requiring reduction. Yet the scale of disposal, destroying over 90% of the inventory within 5 years, ensured that little physical evidence survived. Future generations would study amphibious operations through documents and photographs, but few could examine the actual vessels that made them possible. This pattern repeated across military equipment categories from Liberty ships to bomber aircraft, creating historical amnesia about the material scale of American wartime production. The ethical complexities of disposal primarily centered on environmental factors rather than the moral questions surrounding other military technologies. Landing ships were uncontroversial weapons, defensive in nature, essential for liberating occupied territories. Their destruction raised questions primarily about waste and historical loss. The vast quantities of steel and equipment destroyed while Europe and Asia desperately needed reconstruction seemed economically questionable even at the time. Nevertheless, military and budgetary imperatives overrode preservation concerns. The Navy calculated that maintaining excess capability cost more than building new vessels when actually needed, a calculation the Korean War partially validated. Today, visitors to the handful of surviving landing ships can appreciate the engineering that moved armies across oceans. LST 325 offers tours demonstrating how vehicles drove through the bow doors, how crews of 130 men lived for weeks at sea, and how the ship beached itself, then retracted without assistance. These museum vessels connect modern audiences to the massive logistical effort that characterized American military operations. Yet the very rarity of survivors emphasizes how thoroughly history eliminated what was once the largest amphibious fleet ever assembled. Of 10,000 landing craft built, perhaps a dozen survive in any form. The rest returned to scrapyards, sank as targets, or dissolved in tropical waters, their contribution to victory remembered, but their physical presence erased. The environmental legacy of landing ship disposal remains visible across the Pacific. Abandoned LST hulks still rust in remote lagoons, leaking residual fuel and paint into tropical ecosystems. Breaking yards at Terminal Island and mobile dumped waste materials directly into harbors without environmental safeguards. These sites required remediation decades later as toxic metal contamination became apparent. The asbestos insulation used extensively in landing ships exposed both wartime crews and post-war scrapping workers to health hazards that manifested as disease decades after exposure. Modern environmental assessments reveal that rapid disposal created long-term costs invisible to 1940s planners. The human cost of operating landing ships during wartime deserves acknowledgement alongside their post-war fate. LST crews faced hazardous duty beaching on hostile shores under enemy fire. Casualty rates among amphibious forces ran high during major operations. Yet, post-war, these veterans received less recognition than other naval personnel. The vessels they crewed, whilst crucial to victory, lacked the prestige of battleships or carriers. The systematic elimination of landing ships after the war erased physical reminders of their service. Only recently have amphibious warfare veterans received fuller recognition for their contributions to Allied victory. The global proliferation of American landing ship technology influenced naval development worldwide. Nations receiving LSTs reverse-engineered designs, creating indigenous variants. Japan's post-war maritime self-defense force developed landing ships drawing heavily from captured American examples. South Korea built LSTs based on transferred vessels. Even nations that never received American ships studied the design, recognizing its utility for literal operations. The LST concept, a vessel that could cross oceans, then beach itself to deliver heavy equipment, proved universally valuable. This proliferation meant that American wartime innovation shaped amphibious capabilities globally for decades, even as the original vessels vanished. The few surviving landing ships serve purposes beyond simple museum display. LST-325's regular operations demonstrate that properly maintained examples can function nearly 80 years after construction. This longevity validates the robust engineering that went into supposedly temporary wartime vessels. The ships also serve as floating classrooms, teaching naval architecture students about landing craft design principles. Their simplicity makes them ideal for understanding fundamental concepts of amphibious operations. Veterans organizations use them for reunions, allowing aging sailors to walk decks they once crewed in combat. These multiple purposes justify preservation costs that might otherwise seem excessive for unglamorous cargo vessels. The story of America's landing ship fleet reveals the unglamorous aftermath of total war. While historians focus on dramatic technology races and strategic weapons, the fate of thousands of utilitarian cargo vessels affected more lives directly. These ships carried occupation forces, repatriated prisoners, supported reconstruction, and eventually equipped Allied navies worldwide. Their near-complete disappearance within 5 years of war's end demonstrates how quickly even massive military investments can vanish when strategic circumstances change. The handful that survive connect us to the industrial achievement that moved armies across oceans, reminding us that victory depended as much on unglamorous logistics as on celebrated weapons.